Thanks very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come speak about my book. A passion of mine. It's my baby, and I love discussing it, and I still find it interesting, so I hope you guys do too. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my observations, some lessons from the research behind my book, and I'll also talk a little bit about what's going on now on Wall Street and some of the big traders and that I cover day to day, what they're betting on, what they're betting against. And I'll leave some time for Q&A. I often find in these kind of settings people have an interest in discussing journalism, financial journalism per se, perhaps Wall Street Journal, and what we're focused on, those kinds of things. So feel free to kind of ask about the book or any of those kinds of questions as well. My book is called The Gregory Zuckerman. It's about the winners in the whole crisis. And just taking a step back, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and sort of how I found this project. I've been at the Wall Street Journal about 13 years, and I've covered different things, the bond market and the Herd on the Street column I've written, and I write about hedge funds. And I've always been very interested in, fascinated by big trades and strikeouts and big home runs, as it were, on Wall Street. I guess it's my, I'm a sports guy, so I like big strikeouts and home runs. And I also feel as a writer there's a lot of drama and lessons to be learned from people that make really good decisions and do really well as those kind of make mistakes, and you can learn from those as well. So those always have the most drama and the most interest to me. So here I was in the fall of 2007, sitting at my desk, and things were starting to get bad. Wall Street firms were losing lots of money, Merrill Lynch, Citi, and I was covering some of this stuff, and a lot of my colleagues, and kind of figuring out who's next to fall and who's going to have more problems, and eventually things got much worse, obviously. And I got a call from a big hedge fund manager, and this is sort of what I do. We trade information. And he said, Greg, I just played tennis with a guy. His name is John Paulson. I barely knew who he was at the time. This is the hedge fund manager saying it. And I just could not believe how much money he's making now while everyone else is losing money. And it was an intriguing conversation, both because here was a guy who was actually doing well as the world was starting to implode, but also because my contact, who was among the biggest hedge fund managers out there on Wall Street and most respected investor, he hardly knew much about this guy, John Paulson. So if he didn't know much about him, and I had heard of John Paulson and I met with him a few times, but he wasn't exactly on my radar screen at the time. So he didn't know much about him. I didn't know that much about him, and yet he was the one who had figured this whole thing out. So they got me really excited. So I started working on this project. I wrote a front-page story for the Wall Street Journal. Then I followed it up with about a year or so of work on my book. And my book is about it's about the winners in this crisis, as I said, John Paulson and others. But behind it all, what propels it all is sort of a conundrum that it shouldn't have been John Paulson. It shouldn't have been these investors that I write about who made the billions and figured it out and anticipated this collapse. The investors who should have been the ones I was writing about included people like George Soros, obviously, bet against the British pound. At the time, it had been the greatest trade ever until John Paulson and the investors that I write about. He should have done this trade. He didn't. Warren Buffett, obviously, the greatest investor of the century, of the past century or so. He could have done it. He didn't do it. Mike Vranos is a expert in mortgage-backed securities, and that's what John Paulson threw himself into learning about and analyzing and betting against. And Mike Vranos didn't do this trade. Jim Chanos is the most famous short seller out there. And this trade is a short sale. It's betting against things. And Jim Chanos didn't do this trade. David Tepper, who is someone I wrote about more recently, he made $7 billion last year. And he's known for his big trades, big bets. He doesn't care if things go up, go down. He's okay with that. It's very volatile. He didn't do this trade. He was told about this trade. Friends of his, and including some of the people that I write about, said, hey, you should be doing this trade. And he didn't. And that kind of fascinates me and continues to do so. And yet, so it wasn't these group of kind of the big names on Wall Street. And those that did it include John Paulson, as I mentioned. And just to tell you a little bit about John Paulson, he spent a career on Wall Street. He went to NYU undergrad, did very well, went to Harvard Business School, again did well, and started off as an investment banker at Bear Stearns, and then he left to do his own investing at his own hedge funds. But what he focused on, what he specialized in, was merger arbitrage. And merger arbitrage is among the safest kinds of investing. Basically, you buy the stock that's being acquired, and you short or you bet against the company that's doing the acquisition. And you could shake it up a little bit, and sometimes he did, but it's not full of risk. You can do better than the next guy, and John Paulson had a good career and had a good track record, but he was a merger arb. He never did more than 15, 20% gains in a single year. And yet he was the one who did this trade. His right-hand man, the one really key in this trade, is a gentleman named Paolo Pellegrini. And Paolo's a native of Italy and also a smart graduate of Harvard Business School. He is even more unlikely to have played such a crucial role in the greatest financial coup in history. He spent a career kicking around Wall Street. He was an investment banker at Lazard Frere, didn't do very well, never got a promotion that he always wanted, never really rose very far, ended up leaving Lazard Frere, did some trading on his own. He didn't do so well. He tried to trade he was twice divorced and traded some of his wife's money a little bit, didn't really work out so well, and had some of these great ideas. Yeah, you don't want to do that too much. He had his great ideas, always had great business ideas, was an innovative guy, but didn't really work out so well for him. Again, sharp as they come. And yet, so he calls up in the spring of 2005. He was out of a job. He was living in Westchester, north of New York City, in a one-bedroom apartment. He had two children from one of his marriages, one of his two marriages, and he didn't want to have to go back to Italy and leave them behind, his children, so he really wanted a job. And he was approaching 50, and it's tough on Wall Street. It's a young person's kind of business, the financial industry, and he was aware of that, and he called up John Paulson asking for a job. And they overlapped a little bit at Bear Stearns, and Paulson took his call, and this again is 2005, and Paulson said, well, the only job I really have here, Paolo, is as an analyst, and that's only because somebody has left to go to business school. So you don't really want that job, a lot of grunt work. And Paolo said, no, I'll take that job. I'd like that job. And he ended up joining Paulson and Company, and again, unlikely, 2 years later, in the fall of 2007, he was on vacation with his third wife, and talk about the greatest trade ever. So he's on vacation with his new wife, and they're in, I think it was St. Bart's, and they stop to check the ATM. She stops to just get some money out of the ATM, and he hadn't really told his wife too much about the trade they were working on. He's a little superstitious, and he didn't want to jinx it too much. And she had a vague awareness that it was going pretty well, but not many details. He didn't give him too many details. And so she's at the ATM, and she checks it, and she's like, Paolo, there's $45 million in our account. And to that time, he really had very little money in his bank account, which is kind of shocking. And that $45 million was part of the $175 million that he made as a bonus for that trade, for that year, 2007's trade. So again, he goes from having nothing really in a one-bedroom apartment in 2005 to 2 years later, he's got $175 million in the bank and in St. Bart's having a good time. So he's unlikely. Why was it Paolo Pellegrini? The other characters I track, equally unlikely. There's a doctor turned investor in Northern California named Michael Burry. And Michael Burry actually was early on this trade, before Paulson, before many others. And he's a headstrong guy. He's a little bit stubborn. He didn't always get along so well with his own investors. A lot of them didn't really believe in him. Here's a doctor. And he was doing really well with betting on stocks, but
And as we'll talk about in a second, this trade had nothing really to do with stocks. It was derivatives and it was mortgages. And a lot of his own investors didn't really believe in him.